Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika-prana nātapada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Krishna, Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam dantoye yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasamme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Parapadme Bhaktir ya nikilarta varga janani ya brahma sakshat krite anandati shaya praravishaya jatsukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Vajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavad Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikilagha Sangha Shamani Shrodra Tritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today we'll continue our discussion of the fourth verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. And we'll come to the tail end. We've, in the last recent classes, been discussing the negation of ambition for wealth and so forth, and why this affirmation and negation is relevant to and essential to the prayer for the attainment of causeless or desireless nishkama bhakti. So, lastly, we left off with discussion of the numerous detriments that arise from wealth, the anarthas that arise from artha, and also a statement of Sri Krishna in which he says that persons who prefer wealth in lieu of bhakti or in lieu of him, let them be where they are in the world, I don't need to give them anything more if that's really what they're set upon. So that's where we left off. So today we'll wrap up that discussion about the role of wealth and desire for wealth and our discussion of this prayer. So I'm just picking up where I left off in the previous file. Given that wealth can thus be a cause of delusion and so many detriments, and that Sri Bhagavan himself considers it grace upon his bhaktas that they be freed from wealth, the following statement in Mahabharata can take on added significance. So this statement is as follows: Dharmibhi pumbhir aniharta prashasyate prakshalanadhi pankasya durad asparshana baram. Indifference towards wealth on the part of dharmic persons is praiseworthy. Remaining untouched by mud from afar is certainly better than washing it off after stepping in it. In other words, better to foresee the problem and avoid it than get yourself into the problem and then have to get yourself out of it. So rather than thinking, oh, let us amass a whole bunch of wealth in order to do dharma, rather, first of all, better to be indifferent towards wealth and do whatever amount of dharma one is able to with the resources that one has. So, despite the detriments produced by wealth, however, so now that we've negated wealth severely, step by step, again and again, and how, then one may consider, well, how are we to practically carry on, or does that mean that to the nth degree, the less wealth, the better? So to address that, it is also said that some measure of wealth, or at least fundamental resources, is required by everyone to sustain their bodies and engage themselves in the practices of bhakti. Sri Rupa Gosvami thus mentions, among the 64 limbs of sadhana he discusses in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the practice of, quote, attending to all practical affairs or matters as far as required. Vyavahareshu sarveshu yavarartanuvartita, and illustrates this as follows. So he cites this verse in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu: Yavatasyat svanirvaha svikuryat tavarartavit adikye nunyatayam cha chavate paramartaha. One who is sagacious, meaning a knower of utility, or literally an artavit. So this whole topic yesterday or in the previous class, that arta leads to anartas. Nevertheless, here it's saying that one who's artavit, one who understands arta, should accept as much as shall be supportive for oneself. So even though arta leads to anartas, there's also some arta that will lead to, that is essential for paramarta. So here's arta. It can take you to anarta. It is also essential to paramarta. So the amount or the measure that is efficiently leading to paramarta without involving one in anarta, this is the balance to be achieved. And simply the verse says svanirvaha, or to support oneself, or to keep one sustained, so to speak. But Jiva Gosvami, he comments in this regard that means supportive of one's practice of bhakti. So he comes in and adds this bit that sva here can be taken to mean bhakti. So because the context here is the discussion of this as a limb of bhakti, to say that whatever should support oneself, rather there isn't even a concept of self independent of bhakti. In other words, for a sadhaka, it means one who's taken up the path of bhakti, they have no fundamental aim or purpose or sense of identity other than that of being an aspirant of bhakti. So to be supportive of quote-unquote oneself factually means to be supportive of one's cultivation of or one's pursuit of bhakti. So then whatever amount of artha is required to achieve that, since bhakti has been made one's purushartha or paramartha, then that much is desired. And not only desired, but required. One diverges from the ultimate goal, or the paramartha, as a result of excess and deficiency. So having too much wealth is a problem, having too little is also a problem. So typically, too little is something people can easily understand and are keen to avoid. But the problems that arise from too much are more often left unaddressed or even restyled as advantageous. So vigilance or care is to be kept on both sides as far as possible. And that will be unique to every individual's situation, circumstances, etc. So if you put this in context, if Mahaprabhu is saying, "Na dhanaṁ," I don't want any wealth, I only want ahaitukī bhakti, nevertheless, inherent in or part of ahaitukī bhakti is this yavarartha nivartita, or proceeding according to what is required. So to pray for bhakti can be seen to contain in it a prayer for having the right balance of resources such that one can efficiently and effectively engage in the practice of bhakti. So in that way, it's not that any and all wealth absolutely is excluded from what is being prayed for, what is being not desired, but rather that all desire needs to become bhakti and bhagavat centric is the ultimate import of all of this. So thus, with respect to this aspect of sadhana bhakti, it should be understood that Sriman Mahaprabhu's intent in saying that he does not desire wealth in the verse under discussion does not imply that a bhakta shall not accept an amount of wealth that is commensurate to their needs, but rather that wealth is in no way to be valued independent of bhakti, as the spirit of Sriman Mahaprabhu's prayer is that a bhakta desires only bhakti and accepts only what is required to pursue that ideal, not more and not less. Okay. Sri Rupa Gosvami also clarifies in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that bhakti which is not performed by oneself personally, and rather only by way of wealth or followers, is not a limb of Uttama Bhakti. So he says, Dhanashishyadi bhir dvaraya bhaktir upapadyate viduratvad uttamaya uttamata hanya tasyascha nangata. That bhakti which is accomplished through wealth, disciples, and so forth has no limbship, that is not a limb of pure bhakti, because of the loss of purity or superlativeness, the uttamatva, on account of its being far from that. In other words, bhakti is only uttama when it's done by oneself and it's done according to all the characteristics that are present in the definition, without any desire other than bhakti and Bhagavan. So, and it's not covered over by karma or gyan or these other things. So if it's not even being done by you, it's being done by someone else, then it can't qualify as being uttama bhakti sadhana. There's some covering, some taint in that particular expression. So, he further lists, among the 64 limbs of bhakti he discusses in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, those of not being followed by many disciples, and so forth, non-commencement of grand undertakings, and so forth, and shunning, studying, and teaching numerous texts and arts, as well as debating. Sri Jiva explains in his commentary in regard to these limbs of bhakti, that the intended sense is that one should not seek or accept disciples who are not intent upon Bhagavan. That is, who are not actually interested in the path of bhakti and do not have the requisite eligibility, for the purpose of increasing one's own sampradaya. So this is specifically what he mentions. In other words, if we say, we want our sampradaya to grow, we want more and more people to identify as members of our sampradaya, So we'll give them diksha, we'll engage them. And exactly how qualified they are or not qualified they are, exactly how interested they are, exactly how much they know or don't know, we're not all that concerned about that. If they're this much, if they're just willing to accept being designated as part of our group, that's good enough for us. We'll initiate them into the group. This mentality, this is what is being censured here by Jiva Gosvami, that one shouldn't have the ambition of simply increasing the size of one's sampradaya. Rather, there should be an ethic that no entrance should be given to the sampradaya to someone who's not eligible for it. Otherwise, what do you have? You have people who verbally say that they're part of something, but they actually aren't having the eligibility for it. In other words, they aren't actually a part of it, so to speak. They're not actually practicing it or representing it as it's meant to be practiced. So you have something that thus exists in name without the content being supporting what is being said. In other words, you, so to speak, weaken the currency, just as inflation reduces the purchase power of a particular currency. Then when you propagate and accept so many people into a sampradaya who have lesser and lesser qualification, lesser and lesser levels of education and shraddha and so forth, then you, so to speak, inflate, you undergo inflation, where this thing called the sampradaya is now widely spread. There's big ranks, but what it is that's actually the object that's being now referred to using that word is now a different object. It's something that's of lesser quality, lesser content than what that word was previously referring to. The referent has been changed, but the referrer or the word using to refer to that different object has remained the same. So this can be, in some sense, misleading or unfortunate. So along these lines, neither is oneself, in other words, neither does one's own practice of Uttama Bhakti increase by engaging disciples in doing it or by engaging others in doing it by means of wealth, nor is it even sanctioned as a practice of Uttama Bhakti to actively seek to involve people in it who are not eligible for doing so. So now if you combine those things and both give initiation to people who are ineligible and then think that by engaging those unqualified people in a unqualified practice that one's own Uttama Bhakti is therefore being accomplished, then you're, doubly you're committing two fouls at the same time, so to speak. So these points are relevant because when Mahaprabhu is saying, I don't want wealth, I don't want followers, this means that we shouldn't have any kind of ambition for having a bunch of followers or engaging in big projects or accomplishing grand undertakings by means of having a bunch of money and followers. All of this doesn't enrich one's actual progress on the path of bhakti. It doesn't make one closer to achieving uttamatva, or the purity, the excellence that is the essence of this bhakti, that is what is really pleasing to Bhagavan. So therefore this negation of ambition for wealth and followers is very important. Sri Chakravartipad, following Sri Samipad, further explains this limb of bhakti to indicate that one should not make disciples by force, by way of alluring them and the like. So by, promising them, jobs or giving them some, privileges of belonging to a group or whatever, if this is a way by which you coerce people to pledge allegiance to a particular guru or a particular sampradaya, then this is also censured here. Similarly, grand undertakings, studies, and intellectual discourse that diverts the mind from bhakti and Bhagavan are to be avoided. So when he says here that that also one should not engage in studying and teaching numerous texts and arts, then those are numerous texts and arts that don't have to do with bhakti, or that don't lead to a deepening in the understanding and practice of bhakti. So whether it's discourse or debate or study or projects or what have you, if any of those things result in the mind being less focused on bhakti and Bhagavan, then those things are not considered beneficial. It should be recognized that these are all primary means of attaining prestige, pratishta. So how do you get pratishta? You either have to have, a bunch of money, a bunch of followers, a bunch of knowledge, special skills in particular arts, or have some particular variety of persuasion or charisma. So all of these things lead to pratishta, and all of these things that lead to pratishta, guess what? They all have these cracks on them, or they're all in various ways given some stricture or some, hold on them, so that people don't become preoccupied with them. So underlying one's pursuit of any or all of those things is often also the desire for prestige, which Sanatana Pad describes as the most difficult thing to relinquish even for a highly renounced person. So sarva tyaga pyaheyaya sarvanartha bhuvaschate kuryu pratishthavishtaya yatnam asparshane varam. It is best that they, meaning one-pointed bhaktas of Bhagavan, shall try to be untouched by the stool of pratishta, which is a cause of all anarthas, and difficult to abandon even after the relinquishment of all else. So here it seems to me that this choice of wording, saying, better that they remain untouched, harkens back to this verse that we quoted earlier from Mahabharata, and there are also some subhashitams that use this language, using the same phrase, asparshanam or asparshane varam, that better to be untouched than get in the mud, is this common saying, which is in this Mahabharata verse and in other subhashitams. So I can't say for certain, but my speculation is that drawing upon that common phrase in Sanskrit literature, Sanatana Gosvami applied the concept but then intensified the rhetoric by saying, rather than saying, better not to step in the mud, he says, better not to be touched by the stool of pratishta. So it's one thing to step in the mud, it's another thing to step in stool. So he seems to have wanted to make the point even a little bit more strongly. Perhaps I can't claim that's what he had in mind, or what exactly he might have, read or had informed his compositional choices, but that's a thought that's come to my mind at least. In any case, the overall point is that pratishta is very hard to let go of. And so if we truly want to be one-pointed upon Bhagavan, then that too has to be let go of. So in the Gita and elsewhere this point is repeatedly made, we should be equal to honor and dishonor. And this is itself emphasized in the third verse of the Shikshastakam, when Mahaprabhu says, Amanina manadena kirtaniya sada Hari, that Hari be praised with non-desire for my own honor and with respectfulness towards everyone else. So to truly fulfill that instruction of Mahaprabhu, we have to ultimately be able to let go of this most difficult to give up desire, which is hard to give up even after you've renounced everything else. Okay, thus, although Sriman Mahaprabhu accordingly negates ambition for poeticism, and more broadly erudition in general, in the verse under discussion, it should also be understood that this does not refer to essential knowledge of the path of bhakti, since Sri Jiva Pad describes the necessity of that in his commentary on the definition of Uttama Bhakti, where it is said that bhakti is uncovered by jnana, karma, and so forth. So, just because this type of point is sometimes also raised, that, Jnana covers bhakti. Jnana means knowledge. Any type of knowledge is obstructive of bhakti. Therefore, don't study Shastra, don't read the Goswamis, don't study Bhagavatam, just chant, or just do service to, the mission, or the mott, or the guru, or the temple, or this, or that. In other words, there's some ethic that deprecates or paints the idea that knowledge even of how to practice bhakti is unfavorable to practicing bhakti. So this is detrimental if people get influenced by this rhetoric, because once someone gets under the spell of this rhetoric, they are unlikely to ever learn that that very rhetoric is not what the Goswamis ever taught, and that actually having knowledge of how to practice bhakti is not only beneficial, but indispensable. So Jiva Gosvami, makes this point as follows, to clarify this right here in the definition of Uttama Bhakti itself. So if we're followers of the Goswamis, the cornerstone of the whole Sampradaya is the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the cornerstone of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is the definition of bhakti. And then right in the commentary on the definition of bhakti, just to be clear, Jiva Gosvami addresses this subject. So he says, Jnanamatra nirbhed brahmanusandanam natu bhajaniya tattvanusandanam api tasya avashya apekshaniyatvat. The word jnana here refers to inquiry into non-differentiated Brahman, and not rather inquiry into the nature of the object of worship, namely Bhagavan, as well. Because of its, meaning that inquiry about Bhagavan, being absolutely necessary. Avashya apekshaniyatvat. So avashya means absolutely or certainly, and apekshaniya means required or to be attended to be considered. So it's absolutely necessary. In other words, if we don't understand who is Bhagavan, if we don't understand how to worship him, how to serve him, then it's highly unlikely that we will. Okay, so in summary, Srimad Mahaprabhu's stated resolve of non-ambition for wealth, people, beautiful women, and poeticism, as well as his implied resolve of non-ambition for moksha, that are presented in the verse under discussion, establish the one-pointedness of the prayer for causeless or ahaitukī bhakti, made in the verse, and of the desire underlying this prayer in the verse, so that sadhakas can understand the nature of Uttama Bhakti and engage in sadhana bhakti with the singular aim of its attainment by the grace of Sri Bhagavan. The stated resolve of non-ambition for objects listed in the verse, which can broadly be referred to as simply Vishai, if we want to refer to all of these 4 points as just one simple category, let's call it Vishai. So objects of the senses in general, also alludes to there being impediments for sadhakas on the path of bhakti, as well as to the inclinations and desires for these objects often being so deeply ingrained in the psyche that it is only by means of steady and perseverant sadhana that one can gradually purify the mind of such attachments and overcome the delusions and rationalizations often made in relation to them. So if we just look at it in the practical sense, why did Mahaprabhu instruct this? Because typically this is the rub, this is where people are stuck, this is the situation that people are struggling with, that the mind is conditioned to have desires and inclinations for these things, and to achieve bhakti, namely ahaitukī bhakti or uttama bhakti, then the mind has to be reattuned. So the verse under discussion thus further indicates that it is foolhardy to take a light-hearted attitude towards these impediments, mistake them for facilities favorable for the path of bhakti that ought not be minimized and even be actively amassed, and immaturely assume that one can remain in the midst of an abundance of these objects and still progress in the process of purifying the psyche of attachment to them. So as we've shown, and as we've discussed earlier, and we'll discuss again later in this commentary, mahats, param bhaktas, they can exist even in the midst of quote-unquote temptations or the presence of power, the presence of wealth, and that doesn't contaminate their bhakti. So if we say, okay, these great bhaktas can do that, so we'll follow the path of the Mahajans and we'll do that too. Well, it's a bit like saying, these great swimmers are all swimming in the deep end, and I, who am just learning how to swim, I'll go swim in the deep end too. It's like, well, not a good idea, friend. Start swimming in the shallow end where you don't drown. Start swimming where you're, more likely to gradually learn and gradually develop the ability to, swim without going down, in other words, or remain without subject to the influence. So if one prematurely tells people, oh, it doesn't matter, these great bhaktas, they do it, so you can do it too, without giving due weight to how significantly ingrained most people's psyches are with attachment to these things, and how gradual and delicate it is a process to try to reattune the psyche, then it can lead to some foolhardiness, and some, unfortunate incidents where people, sort of go about certain involvements with certain amount of confidence and then end up, straying from vows that they made or responsibilities that they took on, and this often can sometimes disappoint persons who put them up on a pedestal in their mind or saw them in a high light or all these kind of things. So to prevent all this kind of inflationary conduct, if we can have a sober, grounded approach to and good clarity about the actual state of our psyche, the actual capacity we have to gradually attune it, gradually purify it, and take a modest, gradual approach, then we can prevent, unexpected and unfortunate circumstances, and we can make modest, gradual progress, and we can avoid, ushering in greater difficulties for ourselves in the name of supposedly, helping ourselves. So Sriman Mahaprabhu, in no uncertain terms, spoke strongly in this regard to Sri Raghunath Goswami. Quote, Bishayar swabhav kore maha anda, se karma karai, jate hoy bhavabhanda. The nature of Bishoy makes one severely blind. It causes one to perform karma, whereby worldly bondage accrues. This is from the mouth of Mahaprabhu, according to the Charitamrita. The nature of Bishoy makes one severely blind. So if we say, oh, Rupa Goswami said yukta vairagya, that we won't be influenced by this. It's like, be careful, friend. And that's not actually what Rupa Goswami meant either. But I don't want to go on a whole tangent on that. But look at this. Mahaprabhu is giving a stern warning to none other than Raghunath Das Goswami, that this Vishay can make you severely blind. And what do blind people do? They can walk the opposite way they think they're walking. They can even believe that this thing that's detrimental to them is no problem for them. They can fail to recognize what they're even dealing with. Srimad Bhagavatam similarly refers to Vishoy as something that pollutes the psyche and compares it to an extremely arduous, poisonous ocean. The Bhagavat Mahatma section of Padma Puran contains an address to people of the world as, quote, you all whose minds are bewildered by attachment to the poison of Vishoy in essenceless samsara. In this asara samsar, your mind has been poisoned. Oh ho. Sri Haridas Thakur, after he was jailed for refusing to stop chanting the name of Sri Bhagavan, also advises the inmates of the jail where he was held to forsake Vishoy. So Haridas Thakur says as follows, Vishoy takite Krishna prem nahi hoy. Vishoyira dure Krishna janiho nishchoy. Krishna prem does not manifest in the presence of Vishoy. Know for certain that Krishna is far from Vishoyis. Vishoya vishtaman boravi janjal, daive kono bhagyavan sadhu sangya pai. A mind absorbed in Vishoy is a great disturbance. If by destiny some fortunate person attains the association with the sadhu, Vishoya vesh chari Krishna re bhajai, then one gives up absorption in Vishoy and serves Krishna. Seya savaparad habe punar bhar, Vishoyra dharmai shuno kotasar, Vishoy pasara aharnisha bolo hari. So he says, all those offenses, meaning all the crimes in the form of various types of harm of other living beings that you all have committed and thus wound up in jail, will happen again. So he's saying, you're in jail, you're going to get out of jail, what are you going to do? If you don't change the way you think, you're going to end up behaving in the same way again. This is the nature of Vishoy. So the nature of Vishoy is that the samskaras and vasanas produced by thought and action related to it lead one to repeatedly engaging in the same sort of thoughts and action again in the future. So he says, listen to the essence of my message, forget Vishoy, and day and night chant Hari. So in compressed simplicity, this is how Haridas Thakur conveys all of these points. I'm sorry, Marta, I'm right in the middle of the class. Do whatever you want. I
often
do whatever you want, just please don't distract me. So, all of this discussion, this analysis, tad kratu nyai, etc., this is all compressed, if you will, into these statements. So, when he's saying, forget Vishoy, chant the name of Hari, in a simple sense, it's that simple. Chant the name of Krishna, that will gradually purify the psyche, and eventually you'll lose your remembrance of Vishoy because your mind will be reattuned such that those samskaras won't be activated, such that it won't come to your mind. But if we, consider it excessively simple, so to speak, we may end up, going on for numerous lifetimes with our Shravan Kirtan and still never achieving the result, as is also explained in the Charitamrita and as we've discussed earlier. So, therefore, these type of advices to change the focus of the mind, we also discussed this point earlier. Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself said that a mind focused on Vishoy goes to Vishoy, a mind focused on me comes to me. The mind of one absorbed in Vishoy is going in one direction, the mind absorbed in me is going in another direction. You can achieve what's present in the east by traveling to the west. All these verses that we discussed earlier are also relevant here. So, to have a clear understanding of what it is that we aspire to, how we can aspire to it, how we can gradually attune the mind such that it becomes more and more natural, more and more momentum builds, so to speak, into a state of absorption in that object. This is how the path is designed. As Rupa Goswami also elsewhere says, there's only two ways to achieve bhava. By doing sadhana and reaching a state of abhinivesh or absorption, or without ever doing sadhana and simply being given this bhava by grace. So the second case, he says, is viral, is extremely rare. And anyone who's hearing this class won't fit that category, because if you're sitting here and hearing a class, you're already doing some type of sadhana. So therefore you haven't achieved bhakti just by kripa, you've already tried to do some sadhana. So you're not a kripa siddha, nor will you be. So realistically, we have to plan, so to speak, to follow the path of sadhana as far as we're able, and that will be successful as far as we achieve sadhana binivesh, absorption in sadhana. And as it was said here, a mind absorbed in vishoy is a great disturbance. In other words, when the mind is disturbed by sanskaras for vishoy, there will not be successful absorption. So we need to reach that state of absorption. To reach that state of absorption, we have to purify the psyche of its attachments of these other sanskaras, whereby those durvasanas, those unfavorable inclinations, will stop dragging the mind elsewhere. So to understand this whole process will help us practice it, will help us have conviction in it, will help us have clarity about it, and we'll see how this prayer of Mahaprabhu is the essence of that whole practice. To say, I pray for this, let me have this, and not that or that or that or that. That in essence is the very cognitive practice, or the inner practice of repeatedly bringing the mind back to the intended object, which is, the mainstay of ongoing practice day in and day out. So this fourth verse of the Shikshastakam is so to the very heart of what it is to take up this path and engage in sadhana. So finally, if someone can, quote, forget Vishoy by doing the inner practice described earlier, while engaging in Namasankirtan and other forms of sadhana bhakti, with the qualities taught by Sriman Mahaprabhu in the third verse of his Shikshastakam, and the prayer for causeless bhakti stated in this fourth verse of his Shikshastakam, then by his grace one is sure to attain siddhi on the path of bhakti, that is, to attain bhava, the primary characteristic of which is, as we've discussed, tadika sprihatvam eva, desirousness solely of Sri Bhagavan alone. So Mahaprabhu is saying here, let me only desire bhakti, or in other words, let me only desire Bhagavan, service to Bhagavan, and bhava bhakti is defined as desiring only that. So this prayer is an expression of the state of desire that one aspires to. So a sadhaka may not have, or won't have, the bhav of a brajabasi, which is constantly filled with longing for Krishna. But the desire of the sadhaka is to have that desire. It's lobh, it's intense desire for the bhav, which is made up of desire for Krishna. So we desire to have that desire. We desire to have that manner and richness of desire as found in the bhava of the Brajabasis. This is the attitude or the fundamental concept of ragatmika bhakti and the raganuga sadhana process by which one seeks to achieve some variety thereof. So that concludes our extended discussion of verse 4 of the Shikshastakam. So we have 2 verses left of this prakaran on Sotsukya Prarthana. I'd like to stop here for today, a little short, and then we can do these 2 last verses in a separate discussion and conclude this whole prakaran. So that's it. If anyone has a comment or a question, correction or anything, please feel free to share. Yes, Vidyaji.
Jai Radha, can you hear me?
I can. Jai Shri Radhe.
Okay. Jai Shri Radha, Pranam. Thank you very much. This is very to the point class. I really like that. Somebody may argue that, first of all, sharing or increasing sampradaya in a mood of, being mercy and, giving chances to others to come into the part of path of bhakti, no matter what, it's the highest and the type of regulations. And also there's arguments saying, how can you challenge that? Because, we feel gratitude, then we cannot criticize that kind of indiscriminate distribution. Because we are, recipient of that, and so we are very grateful. How can you challenge that? So can you just in context of what you quoted, in regards to sampradaya, increasing sampradaya to unqualified, to enter some sort of discussion, to rationalize through shastra that kind of responses.
Well, my take would be that being compassionate or being helpful to others or being grateful for what you've received and wanting to share it with others, I'm not going to argue with that. I'm not a grouch. You know? That's all fine, you know. But that and, you know, giving diksha to unqualified people are not the same thing. In other words, that implies that it's either necessary or beneficial to go against what is enjoined as the guideline for how the sampradaya should be by the engineers of the sampradaya. In other words, if Rup Sanatan have this consideration and this is in their books, and now you're saying, oh, well, you know, I mean, in order to serve Rup Sanatan, we need to do what they told us not to do. It's like, I don't know about that one, you know? In other words, we can still stick to the guidelines that they gave, but we can also help people, we can also be kind to people, we can also try to share this with people. If someone has that inclination or someone feels strongly in that respect, okay, I'm not going to tell them not to, you know? I might encourage them to make sure they're actually seriously practicing it themselves before they go too far down that line. But regardless of that, you can help people without having to go against the underlying etiquette and sadachar. There's a balance between those two things. So this idea that people are like, you know, because they succeeded in spreading it, whatever means they took is justified. Personally, I can't wave a flag to that one and say, oh, great.
So you were saying that that particular instruction refers to giving particular diksha, not to, you know, expanding in a sense of distributing knowledge, but particularly diksha should be given only to most qualified. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the context of the statement is that saying one should not seek or accept disciples who are bahirmukha or who are not actually qualified.
Oh, bahirmukha are complete non-devotees. They're not interested at all, right?
Well, that's where you would start the gray area. In other words, at what point is someone bahirmukh or antarmukh, right? That is a massive grayscale, which for Jiva Gosvami, to be the only people who are truly antarmukh are siddha bhaktas, are mahatmas, right? And then, so you have this massive grayscale going from someone who's, you know, at the, you know, engaged in, let's say, just constant aparad, just to make it extreme. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Mahatmas, whose every act is profoundly satisfying to Bhagavan. And so in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he's saying that this entire process is just a shift from bahirmukata to antarmukata. So it's not that, you know, so then at what point do you say someone is bahirmukha or not bahirmukha? You know, then that's what needs to be understood, or that's where you can start to refine what they really meant by this. And when he's also speaking about anadikaris, then, you know, then you have to say, okay, well then to be an adhikari, they would have to have the adhikar described in these texts. So then look at the adhikar, and then look at what the people have been taught, see do they have the adhikar or not, to what extent they have the adhikar. All of these considerations lead to, you know, some more precision in the application of the injunction.
Mm-hmm. What comes to mind is because you mentioned this massive gray area from 0 to 100, is that Rupa Gosvami in Bhaktas Sindhu points, he gives example of Sadhaka Bhakta, and that's before Mangal Thakur, just for the reference. So,
yeah, I mean, in the language of the Sindhu, a sadhaka is a bhava bhakta.
oh, okay. Oh,
In other words, you know, when he's saying a bhakti sadhaka, he means someone who actually has bhakti and who's engaging in it, and then by engaging in it, they reach the state of prema. So, in the language of the Sindhu, a sadhaka means someone at the stage of bhava bhakti progressing towards the state of prema bhakti.
oh, I see.
Strictly speaking, that is. And then, you know, more broadly, we often use the term to say someone who's engaged in what Rupa Goswami has defined as sadhana bhakti is a sadhaka. So that's, you know, not precisely how he uses the term in the text, but, you know, you can say by, you know, sadachar or by convention, it's a common way that is spoken by, you know, bhaktas throughout the sampradaya. So as long as it's understood what's intended, no harm.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that this qualification is to master some kind of art skills and stuff. Does this refers to the same person that gives increasing sampradaya by giving diksha to unqualified, or that particular?
That's a separate point. I mean, he's saying that one of the practices of bhakti this is in the section of the nishedātmakas, or the practices in the form of avoidance of certain unfavorable things. So he's saying that to follow this means that also implies avoiding studying and teaching numerous texts and arts. So, you know, something like Jyotish, you know, is, you know, I mean, now, you know, there's many bhaktas out there that are Jyotishis. I'm not trying to upset them here or, you know, say that they're not bhaktas or anything like that, but just to say that as far as practicing bhakti goes, you know, it's not that, you know, learning or going into a cultivation of Jyotish in and of itself is an act of practicing bhakti, and that would be an instance of learning a certain art or texts or bodies of knowledge which some may consider favorable as a profession, as a side act that someone might do. Okay, fine, but the point he's trying to make here is just there should be just a clear-cut distinction that is not directly, you know, to be considered the same thing as studying Bhakti Shastra.
Okay, I understand. But it could be taken as a profession for earning.
Well, I mean, you know, that's. I mean, Rupa Goswami is not giving, professional advice here, so to speak. He's not regulating what type of work people have. So he's just defining how to follow the path of sadhana itself.
Sadhana, okay, I understand. Because it ties to previous point of having the minimum. So some effort to make money has to be taken in order to maintain one's bhajan, actually, in a way. So,
right.
So the minimum, the less the minimum is also destructive to bhakti. So how are you going to do that? You take occupation that will be more conducive or aligned with bhakti, closer to bhakti as possible. Like, for example, Vedic arts, in order to sustain one's bhajan, not to master the art, Vedic art, in order to, put more shraddha over there.
Yeah, I mean, you can see in Hari Bhakti Vilas, in the schedule of the day that's laid out, Sanatana Gosvami includes a section in the mid-morning for the sort of hypothetical Brahman Vaishnav sadhaka to engage in teaching of students for some period of the morning. Meaning, and not meaning bhakti, meaning teach, brahmanas who are teaching the branch of the Vedas that's part of their family tradition, or teaching Vyakaran or whatever, you know, he allows, or he mentions that this is where it would fit naturally into the person's daily schedule. You know, so that's a practical consideration. You know, there's these texts are not going into that level of detail. They're just saying that you know, there'll be a window of time where someone engages in their livelihood, whatever that may be. And if someone is a Jyotishi, I'm not trying to say not to be, you know, like, that's fine, whatever, you know. Just the point here is just that there's a distinction between that, and you could then say, well, it's Sangha Siddha Bhakti, or even the occupation that we perform, when it's performed in concert with Sarup Siddha Bhakti, it also becomes an act of bhakti because it's instrumental to the practice of bhakti and it's related to. So in that sense, sure, you could also, in that light, also call it that. So both of those considerations stand side by side. In other words, it is bhakti by association, which means it's not bhakti in and of itself. So depending on what side of the coin you're trying to emphasize, then you have these two different considerations.
No, I'm simply questioning because, you know, sadhana is something practical. So to light our own sadhana, one has to be practical in all activities, and it's not the theory discussed here, right? So
of course.
So that's why I'm raising these questions. Thank you.
Sure. And, you know, in the course of finding what's practical for ourselves individually, then there are many of these considerations, and then there are also, so to speak, the sutras, or the overarching principles that, you know, let us remember Bhagavan, let us not forget Bhagavan. All the injunctions, all the prohibitions are for this purpose. So how we can set up our own lifestyle in our unique circumstances that facilitate that, that's the point of all of this, you know. So in one sense, sometimes in the course of analyzing all these things, it can seem kind of complex, but in terms of how to actually practice it in our life, this is the main, you know, golden rule, if you will. And then we try according to what we're able.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, well then, we can conclude here for this evening, and in our next reading, we'll dive into the remaining verses of this prakaran, complete the prakaran, and then make our way into many other sublime topics here in Sri Rupa Pad's Padyavali. Vaishnavibhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe, Jai.